If you ever wanted a motorcycle, the chances are the first one you dreamed of was a Triumph or a BSA, the badge on the tank of the fastest, most wanted machines in the world. The bikes Brando rode and McQueen raced across the desert. At its peak, the BSA group built one in every 4 motorcycles sold anywhere on the planet, in the largest motorcycle factory on Earth. It survived the Blitz that flattened its Coventry works, survived a war and came back stronger, survived to conquer America, where it outsold every rival and owned the open road. And then, in a little over a decade, the largest motorcycle industry the world had ever seen was simply gone. How does a name that the whole world wanted, an industry that survived everything thrown at it, just vanish from the earth? That's what this is about. Chapter 1. The Man Who Drew the Twin. In the years between the wars, Britain made more motorcycles than anywhere on Earth, and it made most of them in a single city. Birmingham, the city of 1,000 trades. If you had walked the streets around Small Heath in the autumn of 1937, you would have heard it before you saw it. The ring of metal on metal, the cough and catch of test engines, the low industrial hum that rose from 100 workshops and never quite stopped. This was the heart of it. And the men who worked here believed, with good reason, that they were simply the best in the world at what they did. The story of how all of that came to an end begins with a draftsman's pencil, and it begins with a man named Edward Turner. Turner was not born to engineering, or to money, or to the Midlands. He came into the world in 1901 in Camberwell, in South London, the son of a small light engineering manufacturer, and he was, by every account that survives, a difficult and gifted man in roughly equal measure. As a young man, he went to sea with the Merchant Navy, and somewhere in those years of watching marine engines turn over in the dark, he developed the 2 qualities that would define the rest of his life. The first was a feel for machinery that bordered on the instinctive, an ability to see in his head how metal parts would move against one another before a single line was drawn. The second was an absolute and unshakable confidence in his own judgment. He was rarely in doubt. He was rarely wrong. And the few times he was, the cost would be enormous. He came back to London and set himself up in a small motorcycle shop in Peckham. He sold other men's machines, repaired what came through the door, and in the evenings he designed his own. He built a single-cylinder engine of entirely his own conception, with an overhead camshaft when most of his rivals were still building side valves, and called it the Turner Special. Almost nobody bought one. It hardly mattered. What mattered was the impulse behind it, that a young man with no factory, no capital and no training had looked at the motorcycles of his day and concluded, without hesitation, that he could do better. That impulse never left him. And in the end, in a way he could not possibly have foreseen, it helped to unmake the entire industry he was about to transform. What set Turner apart from the thousands of other clever men tinkering in sheds was not simply that he could design an engine that ran. Plenty could. It was that he understood something most engineers never grasp at all, that a motorcycle is not only a machine, it is an object of desire. He had the eye of a stylist and the soul of a showman, and he knew in his bones that a motorcycle sold not just on what it did, but on how it looked while doing it. That instinct for beauty, married to a real engineer's grasp of how things worked, would build him an empire. In the late 1920s, that instinct carried him north, out of London, to Birmingham, and to a man named Jack Sangster. Sangster ran Ariel, one of the proud old Birmingham marquees, and he possessed a gift of his own, a gift for spotting talent in others and turning it loose. He took the young, abrasive, self-taught Turner on and placed him in a drawing office alongside 2 men who would matter for the rest of the story. One was Val Page, a meticulous senior designer whose engines were quietly the backbone of half the British industry. A Page-designed Ariel engine, first drawn in 1926, would still be in production, substantially unchanged, more than 30 years later. Hold that detail. It tells you almost everything about the industry Turner was joining, one that found something which worked, and then kept on rewarding it, long after the rest of the world had quietly moved on. The second man in that drawing office was younger still, a careful, principled draftsman named Bert Hopwood, who would become Turner's protégé, in time his rival, and, many years later, the chief mourner of the whole tragic tale. At Ariel, Turner gave the first real proof of what he could do. He took a difficult idea, 4 cylinders arranged in a compact square, 2 crankshafts geared together, and turned it into a working, sellable, beautiful machine, the Ariel Square 4. It was clever in a way that made other engineers stop and look, and it announced that a major talent had arrived. Sangster paid attention. Sangster always did. Then in 1936 came the moment that made Edward Turner into a legend. Sangster bought the motorcycle side of the Triumph Company, a Coventry firm with a famous name and a balance sheet that had very nearly carried it into oblivion. And rather than send in an accountant, Sangster sent in his designer. He installed Turner as chief designer and general manager, a man not yet 35, handed a celebrated old name and a factory in serious trouble, and told, in effect, to save it. What Turner did in answer changed British motorcycling for a generation. He looked hard at the heavy single-cylinder bikes that dominated the British market. Dependable, sturdy, slow, the motorcycling equivalent of a sensible pair of boots, and he saw their weakness with perfect clarity. They were yesterday's bikes. So he reached for an idea that others had tried and abandoned as too rough, too prone to shaking itself apart. The parallel twin, 2 cylinders set side by side, and refined it into something nobody had quite managed before. It was light, it was narrow, it was smooth enough to ride all day, and fast enough to set the pulse racing. He dropped it into a slim, handsome frame, finished the tank in a deep, glowing amaranth red, and in the autumn of 1937 gave it a name that promised precisely what it delivered. The Speed Twin. It weighed a little over 360 pounds, less than the single it replaced. It produced 27 brake horsepower, a serious figure for its day, and it would run beyond 90 miles an hour, and it looked, sitting at the curb, like something from a decade that hadn't happened yet. Riders who had grown up wrestling great thumping singles climbed aboard one and felt the ground move beneath them. So this, they thought, is what a motorcycle could be. It was not merely a success, it was a template. Within a few years, every serious British manufacturer was building a parallel twin cut to the Turner pattern. BSA, Norton, Royal Enfield, Matchless, Ariel itself, all chasing the shape of engine a self-taught man from Camberwell had drawn at a board in a Coventry office. For the next 30 years, the British motorcycle, the very thing the world pictured when it imagined a proper bike, would be, in its essentials, Edward Turner's idea, refined and re-refined and sold by the 100,000. He had found the formula. That was his genius. The tragedy, though not a soul could see it in 1937, was that the industry would fall so completely in love with that formula that it would still be selling warmed-over versions of it when the world had moved somewhere else entirely. The thing that built them would, in time, help to bury them, but all of that lay decades downstream. In 1938, Edward Turner stood at the top of his trade, his name on the most desirable motorcycle in Britain, his future apparently without limit. And then the bombs came. Chapter 2. Out of the Fire. On the night of the 14th of November, 1940, the German Luftwaffe came for Coventry. They came in waves for the better part of 11 hours, in an operation the German crews had codenamed Moonlight Sonata. By morning, the medieval heart of the city had ceased to exist, the cathedral a roofless shell, the streets ankle-deep in water from burst mains, the dead still being pulled from the rubble. And there, among the ruins on Priory Street, stood what remained of the Triumph works. The factory where the Speed Twin had been born was a blackened skeleton. The machine tools, the jigs, the drawings, the half-finished bikes, nearly all of it was ash and twisted steel. For a lesser company, that would have been the end. For Triumph, it became the founding legend of its greatest era. Because Turner and Sangster did not fold, they found temporary premises in a former foundry in nearby Warwick, a cramped, leaking building the men cheerfully called the Tin Box, kept the skilled workforce together, and began at once to plan something better than what they had lost. Within 2 years they had it, a brand new factory, modern, single-story, purpose-built, rising from a green field beside a quiet Warwickshire village called Meriden. Meriden liked to call itself the traditional centre of England. There was an old stone cross on the green said to mark the very middle of the country. From 1942 onward, the village was the centre of something else as well. It was where triumphs were made, and that single word, Meriden, would come to stand for the British motorcycle at its proudest, and, much later, at its most heartbroken. The whole arc of this story runs through that one village green. The war that had nearly killed Triumph also, in its strange way, set the whole industry up for the boom to come. And nowhere was that clearer than 3 miles away at Small Heath, where the giant that would soon own Triumph was turning the largest motorcycle factory on earth over to the business of winning a war. This was BSA, the Birmingham Small Arms Company. And to feel the weight of what Britain was about to throw away, you have to understand how vast a thing it was. It had been founded back in 1861 by 14 Birmingham gunsmiths, men of the city's famous gun quarter, who pooled their trades to make rifles for the crown. The name was nothing if not honest. Birmingham, small arms, guns first, everything else after. But the concern that grew from those 14 gunmakers became a sprawling empire. Bicycles, then motorcycles, then motorcars, then steel, then the very machine tools that other British factories used to make everything else. By the outbreak of the Second World War, BSA was among the largest manufacturing groups in the entire British Empire. And when the war came, it gave everything. BSA made rifles by the 100,000, Browning machine guns, cannon for fighter aircraft and motorcycles. Above all, the BSA M20, a tough, plain side-valve single that became the standard British military motorcycle. They built more than 126,000 of them. Dispatch riders carried orders across the deserts of North Africa on the saddle of a BSA. The factory at Small Heath was itself bombed. On one terrible night in 1940, a raid killed more than 50 people and buried others under collapsed floors. And still production never stopped. The surviving plant ran on, the gaps on the line filled increasingly by women, drafted into precision work their mothers would never have been allowed near. When peace finally came in 1945, Britain was victorious, exhausted, and very nearly bankrupt. The country needed one thing above all others, foreign currency, and above all American dollars, to pay for the food and raw materials a broken economy could not yet produce for itself. The government's message to industry was blunt and painted on every factory wall in the land: export or die. And the British motorcycle industry, with its modern Meriden factory, its enormous Small Heath works, and its world-beating Turner twins, was placed about as perfectly as any industry in Britain to answer that call. There was just one question worth asking. Where were all these dollar-paying customers going to come from? The answer lay 3,000 miles to the west, and it would make Triumph rich and famous and, in time, fatally dependent on a single market it could neither control nor fully understand. Chapter 3. The Bridge Across the Atlantic. The customers were in America. In the years after the war, a whole generation of young American men came home with money in their pockets, a taste for speed acquired in uniform, and a restlessness that the wide, empty roads of the United States seemed built to answer. They wanted motorcycles, and the American industry had collapsed back into a single dominant maker of big, heavy, leisurely machines. Into that gap rode the British, light, quick, glamorous, and unlike anything built on American soil. Edward Turner understood the opportunity earlier than almost anyone in Britain. He crossed the Atlantic himself, walked the dealerships, drove the highways, and grasped a single staggering fact. There were more potential motorcycle buyers in the state of California alone than in the whole of the United Kingdom. So he built for them. Twins, bigger, brawnier, more powerful, tuned for long American roads and bold American tastes. And crucially, he did not try to sell them himself. He found Americans to do it. On the West Coast, in Pasadena, a former cycle dealer named Bill Johnson had built the Triumph franchise into Johnson Motors, JOMO to everyone in the trade, an operation that understood the Californian rider in a way no man in Coventry ever could. On the East Coast, Triumph set up its own arm, the Triumph Corporation in Baltimore, run by an expatriate engineer named Dennis McCormack. Between Johnson in the West and McCormack in the East, Triumph built a true American sales machine, and these two men, working an ocean from the factory, sold more Triumphs than the factory could comfortably build. The machine that sealed it arrived in 1949. The Triumph Thunderbird, a 650 twin, bigger and stronger than the original, conceived expressly for the American buyer who wanted more of everything. Turner, the showman, knew a new machine of this importance needed more than a brochure. It needed a legend. So, in September that year, he took 3 brand-new Thunderbirds to the Great Banked Racing Bowl at Montlhéry, outside Paris. Each would be ridden round and round that vast saucer of concrete for 500 miles without let-up, and each would have to hold an average of more than 90 miles an hour to make the point. For hour after hour, the Thunderbirds circulated. 90, then 91, 92, the laps stacking up, the bearings holding. 500 miles each, every machine finished. And then, to drive the lesson home, each was ridden back to the Coventry factory under its own power. It was exactly the kind of theatre Turner loved, and it worked. The Thunderbird became a sensation on both sides of the Atlantic. The name itself would outlive the bike, the factory, and the man, borrowed a few years later for a famous American sports car, sung about, stamped permanently into the culture. By the opening of the 1950s, something remarkable had come to pass. More Triumphs were now sold in the United States than in any other country on earth, more even than in Britain. The bridge across the Atlantic was built and open, and across it flowed a torrent of British motorcycles in one direction and a return torrent of precious dollars in the other. Meriden could not turn them out fast enough, and it was in this very moment of triumph that the structure took shape, which would, decades later, magnify the coming catastrophe to a national scale. In 1951, the giant absorbed the glamour mark. BSA bought Triumph. Jack Sangster sold the company Turner had built, took a seat on the BSA board, and in time, Turner himself rose to command the whole motorcycle empire of the combined group, the most powerful single figure in British motorcycling, presiding over both badges. By 1953, the arrangement was formalised as BSA Motorcycles Limited. On paper, it looked unbeatable. The largest motorcycle producer in the world, the most celebrated sporting marquee in the world, and the most famous designer in the world, all inside one organisation at the summit of its powers. And it was no boast. At its height in the 1950s, roughly 1 in every 4 motorcycles sold anywhere on the planet wore the BSA badge. The works at Small Heath was the largest motorcycle factory on Earth. When the world pictured a motorcycle, it pictured a British one. But mergers carry a quiet logic of their own, and the logic of this one was already working against the future. Turner was a brilliant designer and a ferocious businessman, happiest when costs were low and margins fat. The factories that had powered through the war were aging. The machine tools were old. The methods were the methods of the 1930s, refined but never truly replaced. And as long as the bikes sold faster than the men could build them, which all through the 50s they did, there seemed no earthly reason to spend the fortune real modernization would demand. Why retool a factory that already cannot keep up? Why redraw an engine the whole world is queuing to buy? At the time, it looked like sound sense. It looked like running a tight ship. Bert Hopwood saw it differently. Turner's old protégé had grown into one of the finest engineers of his generation, and he had moved through the great names, Norton, BSA, and back, watching the same pattern repeat. The profits came in. The profits were taken out, and too little flowed back into the plant and the products that had produced them. Hopwood would spend the rest of his life arguing that the seeds of ruin were sown in the fattest years, when there was money to invest and no will to invest it. Long afterward, he set it down in a book whose title was at once an accusation and a lament. Whatever happened to the British motorcycle industry? He was an insider with grievances, and his account leans toward his own vindication. But on the one central point, history would prove him devastatingly right. For now, the sun was high and the dollars flowed, and the Thunderbird thundered. Out on the roads of California, the British motorcycle was on the brink of becoming something far larger than a machine. It was about to become a symbol of rebellion, of freedom, of cool itself. The golden age was beginning, and not one soul inside those crowded, humming, profitable factories had the smallest reason to imagine it could ever end. They were the best in the world. Everyone said so. Even they believed it. Chapter 4. The Floor at Meriden. To understand what the world lost, you have to walk through the gates while the gates were still worth walking through. So, come back to Meriden on an ordinary weekday morning in the early 1960s and arrive the way the men arrived. You'd come in on foot or by pushbike or down from Coventry on the works bus in the grey light. Hundreds of you converging on the same long, low spread of sheds beside the Coventry road. and the first thing you'd notice, before you saw the works at all, was the sound, a deep mechanical breathing you felt in the chest as much as heard. Then the works' hooter, flat and final over the rooftops, marking the start of the shift, and the shuffle through the gates into the ritual that began every working day in industrial Britain. The clocking in, the card pulled from its numbered slot, the satisfying thump of the timestamp. You were in. Be late, and the card told on you, and a few minutes' pay went with it. The clock did not care who your father was. Inside, the smell hit first, and it came in layers. On top, cutting oil, hot and faintly sweet. Beneath it, the sharper reek of petrol from the test bays, and under everything the acrid bite of the plating shop, where the chrome was laid down in tanks no man lingered beside. Then the swarf, fine curled shavings that settled into everything, the turn-ups of your trousers, the grain of the skin on your hands. A tool setter could be known in the pub on a Friday by the silver dust no amount of scrubbing ever shifted from his knuckles. The works was a journey, and the motorcycle made that journey through it, department by department, in a sequence as fixed as a liturgy. It began in the machine shop, the loudest place in the building, where bar stock and rough castings were turned and bored into crankshafts and cylinder heads. Men stood at their lathes for the length of a shift, each master of his own operation. A fixed price agreed for each piece, the work coming and going, the tally mounting toward the Friday packet. A man on a capstan lathe could hold a tolerance finer than a human hair while carrying on a shouted conversation about the weekend's football, because 30 years had put the knowledge somewhere deeper than thought. From there, the parts flowed toward assembly. The engines were built up by hand, crankcases split and joined, the parallel twin coming together piece by piece, torque wrenches and feeler gauges, doing the work that automated stations did elsewhere in the world. Down the line, the rolling chassis took shape. Frames, forks, and the great spoked wheels, laced and trued by men who could draw 40 loose spokes into a perfect running circle by feel and sound alone, plucking each one like a harp string and listening for the note. There was no machine for that. There was only the man and his ear. Then came the parts that made a triumph. The polishing shop where the alloy castings were held against spinning mops until they threw the light straight back. The plating shop, dull steel in, bright chrome out. And the paint shop, the holy of holies, where the tanks received the deep colours that sold the machine across an ocean. It was here that the most quietly astonishing skill in the whole works was practised. The lining, that fine gold stripe down the flank of the tank, was applied entirely by hand. No masking, no tape. A craftsman called a liner drew it with a long bristled brush known as a sword, in a single unbroken stroke down the curving flank. One pass, freehand, perfect. Dozens of times a day, the line never wavering. That stripe was the signature of the entire enterprise, recognised on the far side of the world, and it was put there by a man whose name no customer ever learned. And at last the machine was whole, and now it had to be proven. Out to the test department, where the bikes were ridden hard around the factory roads and out onto the lanes of Warwickshire before they could be crated. The men who did that riding were a breed apart, and the greatest of them at Meriden was Percy Tate, works development rider and racer, a blunt Warwickshire man who rode the prototypes to destruction during the week and raced for the factory at weekends, and who once, famously, kept pace with the fastest 500 Grand Prix machines in the world aboard a road-derived Triumph twin. Tate and the men like him were the conscience of the factory. What left those gates had passed under their hands. A young lad arriving for his first day might be set to sweeping, or stood beside an older man to learn one single operation until it lived in his fingers without thought. The start of an apprenticeship that could run 5 or 7 years before a boy was reckoned a tradesman. He would smell the carbon and the oil and the rouge, and 3 decades later, long after the works was gone, he could summon that smell back in complete and aching detail, because it was the smell of his working life. He had walked that first grey morning into the largest, proudest motorcycle industry on earth, and it would feel, for a good while yet, as though it would last forever. Chapter 5. A Wage and a Way of Life. A great works does not only make a product, it makes a world. The men who built Triumphs and BSAs lived within a short ride of the gates, in the terraced streets of Coventry, the red brick suburbs of Birmingham, the villages strung along the roads between, Many had fathers who had worked the same floors and would have sons who worked thereafter. The factory ran through families across 3 generations, a son following a father onto the line as naturally as inheriting a name. To get a lad set on as an apprentice was a thing a whole family took pride in. It meant security. It meant a trade no one could take from you. It meant a wage packet, counted out in cash on a Friday and handed over at the kitchen table, that could keep a household, service a mortgage and still leave a few shillings over for the weekend. And what that wage bought was an entire texture of life. It bought the pint after the late shift, in the pubs that clustered around every great works in the land, where the talk ran on the bikes and the racing and the failings of the foreman. It bought belonging to the works social club, the brass band, the football team that played other factories across the Midlands, the annual outing packed onto carabancs before dawn for a day at the seaside. The works was not merely where a man spent his days, it was the spine of his whole social world. It was a unionised world, and proudly so. The Transport and General Workers' Union and the engineering unions had sunk deep roots, and the shop steward was a figure of real standing, the man who knew the rate for every job, who could and did call a stoppage if the line was driven too hard or the price set too mean. There was friction in this, as there is anywhere men's livelihoods are bargained over daily, and the disputes were real and some were bitter. But beneath the friction ran a fierce, largely unspoken pride. These men believed in what they made. A man who had trued the wheels on a Bonneville could see that same model in a magazine, ridden by a film star across a desert, and know, quietly to himself, that he had a part in it. Women had their place in this world too, though a narrower one than the war had briefly thrown open. In the wiring shops and the small component assembly, in the offices, and above all in the canteen that fed the entire works at a single sitting, women kept the place running. And in the war years, they had done far more. Run the lathes and the presses themselves, with a precision that gave the lie to every comfortable assumption about who was capable of skilled work. When peace came, most were sent back to the home or the lower-paid benches, in the manner of the age. But the memory of what they had done lingered in the building, like the cutting oil in the air. This was the bargain at the heart of industrial Britain, and around Meriden and Small Heath it held, year upon year, and seemed as solid as the buildings. You gave the works your working life, and your father had given his, and your son would give his. And in return, the works gave back a wage, a trade, a community, and a bone-deep certainty about who you were and what you were worth. It was no romance. The work was hard, the hours long, the bargaining ceaseless. But it was a life with dignity at its centre, and tens of thousands of families built everything they had upon it. When it was finally taken away, it would not be only the jobs that went. It would be the world that the jobs had made. Chapter 6. The coolest machine in the world. By the late 1950s, the British motorcycle had become something no marketing department could have engineered on purpose. It had become cool. It happened in America, largely by accident, through the cinema. In 1953, a young actor named Marlon Brando appeared in a film called The Wild One, playing the brooding leader of a motorcycle gang, and the machine he rode through it, slouched over the bars, cap tilted, the very portrait of post-war youth in revolt, was his own personal Triumph Thunderbird, a British twin beneath the most magnetic young man in American pictures. In the film that more or less invented the idea of the biker, the image went round the world. It was so potent that the British censors took fright and banned the film outright. The Wild One would not be shown openly in Triumph's own country for 14 years. There is the whole strange shape of it in one fact. The machine selling Britain to the world was carrying a film the British themselves were forbidden to watch. 2 years on, James Dean was photographed astride his Triumph in a black leather jacket, careless and beautiful. And then Dean was dead at 24, and the image fused forever. The bike, the jacket, the doomed and lovely youth. And then came the rider who loved the machines most genuinely of all, Steve McQueen, by common consent the coolest man in Hollywood, and no poseur but a fast and gifted competition rider who collected Triumphs and raced them across the California desert. In the 1963 film The Great Escape, the most famous motorcycle scene ever put on film, The Great Leap for the Wire, was performed on a Triumph TR6, disguised with military paint to pass as a German army machine. McQueen wanted to make the jump himself, The insurers refused, and so the leap was made by his friend and stunt double, the legendary Bud Eakins. It didn't matter that audiences believed they were watching a German bike. Everyone in the trade knew. It was a Coventry-built Triumph that cleared the wire, and the machines lived up to the legend. The Bonneville arrived for the 1959 season, and its very name was a boast already made good. 3 years earlier, on the blinding white salt of the Bonneville Flats in Utah, a Texan rider named Johnny Allen had taken a slender, cigar-shaped streamliner, powered by a Triumph twin, across the salt at more than 214 miles an hour, the fastest a motorcycle had ever traveled. A record Triumph would hold for 14 years. The company took the name of that hallowed ground, fixed it to its hottest twin, and the Bonneville became, very nearly overnight, the most desirable motorcycle in the world. BSA had its own object of devotion, the Gold Star, a single-cylinder thoroughbred that took its name from the small gold lapel pin awarded to any rider who lapped the old banked Brooklyn circuit at over 100 miles an hour. The Goldie became the definitive clubman's racer, raced on Sundays and ridden to work on Mondays, and mourned the moment it was gone in 1963. And out of all this, on Britain's own roads, grew a culture entirely homegrown, the ton-up boys, young men in leather who gathered at the transport cafes along the new arterial roads, above all the Ace Cafe on London's North Circular, and lived for speed, for the magic figure of the ton, the 100 miles an hour, and for a machine of their own contriving, the Triton, a Triumph engine in the superb Norton featherbed frame, the best engine in the country, married to the best handling chassis. They were romanticised and feared in equal measure, and a young Anglican curate named Bill Shergold, troubled that no one in the church would go near these boys, climbed onto a motorcycle and rode out to the Ace to meet them on their own ground, and from that founded the 59 Club, which by some reckonings became the largest motorcycle club the world has ever seen. Through all of it, the machines poured out and across the water. At the height of it, the BSA group was turning out well over 70,000 motorcycles a year, and the lion's share of the famous Triumphs crossed the Atlantic to feed an American appetite that seemed to have no bottom. The badge on the tank meant quality, speed, and a particular flavour of British glamour in showrooms from Los Angeles to Sydney to Johannesburg. Brando had ridden one. McQueen raced one. The fastest motorcycle in the world had been won. The British had not merely captured the market, they had captured the dream. Chapter 7. The Summit. In the spring of 1964, Steve McQueen came to Meriden. He came as a member of the American team for the International 6 Days Trial, the grueling test of endurance riding, and while in England, he made the pilgrimage to the factory that built the machines he loved. He walked the floor. He met the men. The biggest film star alive sat among the people whose hands had built his bikes, in a low brick shed beside a Warwickshire village green. It is hard to picture a clearer sign of where the centre of the motorcycling world lay than that. This was the summit, and the view from the top was magnificent, and to very nearly everyone standing on it, the air seemed perfectly clear in every direction. The Bonneville was the most wanted motorcycle on the planet. The order books out of America were full and overflowing, the dealers crying out for more machines than Meriden could crate and ship. The group employed many thousands across its plants, took the Queen's Award for its exports, and could point to a record that ran back unbroken through McQueen and Brando, and the Salt Flats, and Montlhéry, all the way to the Speed Twin itself. A quarter of a century of getting it right. The men who ran the business had every reason for their confidence. They had built the largest motorcycle industry there had ever been, and held it at the top for a generation. The suggestion that any of it might be fragile would have struck most of them as not worth the breath to answer. And there is the dramatic irony that gives this summit its terrible weight. Because by the time McQueen walked the Meriden floor, the warning had already been written. It had been set down 4 years earlier by the most respected man in the entire British industry, after he had travelled to the other side of the world to see the future with his own eyes, and had come home, in his own words, frightened. The warning was in the record. It had been read, circulated, noted, and quietly set aside. The men on the summit were not blind to the storm building on the far rim of the world. They had been told about it, in precise detail, by one of their very own. They simply did not believe, in their bones, that it would ever reach them. The British motorcycle in 1964 was a magnificent thing, fast, handsome, beloved, the object of a worldwide desire no rival could touch, and it was also, though almost no man inside those gates would have accepted the words, a machine essentially of the past, built to a template drawn before the war, assembled in aging factories by methods a generation old, produced by an industry that had spent the long, warm years of its supremacy declining again and again, to prepare for any weather but the sunshine it was standing in. 1964 was not quite the peak of the numbers. The orders would climb a little higher for a few more years before they broke, but it was the peak of the certainty. It was the last clear moment in which the men who ran British motorcycling could survey their kingdom and feel, with total conviction, that it was theirs by right and theirs for good. But that confidence rested on a question none of them was truly asking, and the man best placed in all of Britain to ask it had asked it already, 4 years before, in a quiet, careful, frightened report that named the danger exactly, and reached, on the one decision that mattered most, precisely the wrong conclusion. Standing on the summit in the full sun, with the whole world wanting what they made, not one of them could see the cliff they had begun to walk toward. His name was on that report, and his name was Edward Turner. Chapter 8. The Warning from Tokyo. In September of 1960, Edward Turner went to Japan. He went as the managing director of the automotive division of the BSA Group, the most powerful and respected figure in British motorcycling, the man who had drawn the engine the whole world copied, and he went to see for himself what the Japanese were doing. He toured the factories of Yamaha, of Suzuki, and of a company most British riders had barely heard of, run by a restless, brilliant former mechanic named Soichiro Honda, and then he came home and wrote it all down. The report Edward Turner wrote in 1960 is the most extraordinary document in the whole of this story, because he saw it. He saw nearly all of it. He called the experience, in his own words, a dynamic experience and a somewhat frightening spectacle. He recorded that Japan was already the largest manufacturer of motorcycles in the world, turning out well over 500,000 machines a year against Britain's 140,000. He noted that Honda alone was approaching 250,000 annually, a single Japanese firm outproducing the entire British industry several times over. He saw the research effort, Honda employing 400 technicians on new designs, and he saw the thing that should have frozen the blood of every man on the BSA board, banks of single-purpose automatic machine tools, each doing one job perfectly and endlessly, turning out in a single day what a British works took a week to make. He saw the productivity, he saw the investment, he saw the scale, he saw the future laid out across the workshops of Japan, and he was frightened by it, and he said so in writing, and he sent it home to Birmingham, and then he reached the wrong conclusion, the one that mattered. Turner concluded that the Japanese, for all their terrifying capacity, would not come for the machine the British rider truly wanted, the big, traditional motorcycle. They would stay where they were strong, in the small commuter machines, the step-throughs. The proper motorcycle, the half-litre and bigger, that he judged would remain British. Mr. Honda himself had been gracious, telling Turner flatteringly that the smaller Triumphs were thoroughly up to date. The danger was real, the report said, but it was a danger at the bottom of the market, not the top. It was the single costliest misjudgment in the history of the British motor industry. And the cruelest part is this: Turner was not a fool and not complacent by nature, and he had taken the trouble to go and look when others would not. He simply could not bring himself to believe that the men building those tiny, buzzing machines would ever learn to build a thing a Brando or a McQueen would want to be seen on. He had been to the future and read it almost perfectly and got the one line wrong that the whole company would die by. Turner would step back from the front line not long after, easing out of his commanding role through the middle of the decade. He would not be the man in the chair when the reckoning came. He would die, in fact, in August of 1973. Just as the company he had built was sliding into its final crisis, spared the worst of the sight of it. So when, in the years that followed, the legend grew up that British executives had laughed at the Japanese, sneering that real men kickstart their motorcycles and don't mind a drop of oil on the garage floor, when those phrases hardened into the accepted story of British arrogance, it is worth being clear about what is true and what is not. No one ever found those exact words in the mouth of any named British executive. They are folklore. They are the legend's shorthand for something real, but they were never, so far as anyone has shown, actually said. What was real was the oil, British engines leaked, and they leaked because of how they were built. Crankcases split vertically, where the Japanese split theirs horizontally and sealed them tight. Seals never quite good enough on the kickstart shaft and the gear lever. Tolerances that belonged to an earlier age. A British bike marked its territory on the garage floor, and owners came to treat the puddle as part of the character of the thing, the way you forgive an old friend his faults. And what was also real was the conservatism, a deep-grained belief, from the boardroom down, that the bike Edward Turner had drawn was simply the right shape for a motorcycle to be, and that the customer who wanted something else was not worth chasing. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles from Birmingham, Honda was proving the opposite of everything the British believed. The little machine Turner had been so sure would never threaten him, the Honda Super Cub, was on its way to becoming the most produced motor vehicle in the history of the world. And in America, Honda was doing the unforgivable thing. It was not fighting the British for the existing rider. It was inventing new riders altogether. The advertising said it plainly. You meet the nicest people on a Honda. And with one stroke peeled the motorcycle away from the leather jacket and the menace of the wild one and handed it to the clerk, the student, the ordinary suburban family. The market did not merely shift. It exploded. By the mid-60s, Honda commanded more than half of the entire American motorcycle market, selling to people the British had never even thought to sell to. And behind the friendly advertising stood the figures from Turner's own report, grown more monstrous with every year. They would be set down in cold print a little later, in a government study that landed like a verdict. At Honda's Suzuka factory, something on the order of 350 machines built per man per year. At the British works at Wolverhampton, 18. At Small Heath, the largest motorcycle factory on earth, the pride of Birmingham, 10. 350 against 10. That was the gap. That was what Edward Turner had walked through the doors and seen in 1960, and named and feared, and then talked himself out of believing would matter. The seeds had been in the ground a long time. Now something was coming up the road from Japan, and there were men inside the British industry who could already hear it. Chapter 9. The triple that came too late. There was a way out. That is what makes the next part of the story so hard to bear. The British industry was not doomed by ignorance. It had the engineers, it had the talent, and at the critical moment, it had, drawn and prototyped and ready, the very machine that might have answered Honda, and it could not bring itself to build it. The man at the centre of it was Bert Hopwood, now one of the finest engineers in the country, and his great collaborator, the gifted development engineer Doug Healy. As early as 1963, the two of them had a plan. They would take the Triumph Twin and add a third cylinder, a 750 triple, smoother, faster, a genuine big sporting motorcycle for the 1960s. By 1965, they had a prototype running, fitted into a Bonneville frame, and Hopwood was adamant it was very nearly ready for production. The engineering existed. The opportunity was wide open. All that was required was for management to say yes, and to say it quickly. Management dithered. For 3 years. The men in charge at the BSA Group in those years were not the men who had built it. Eric Turner, no relation to Edward, was chairman, a financial man rather than a motorcycle man. The managing director was Harry Sturgeon, an able and energetic executive who drove the business hard before he was struck down by a brain tumour and died, desperately young, in 1967. And into Sturgeon's place stepped the figure who would come to embody, fairly or not, everything that went wrong in these years. Lionel Joffer, recruited from the aviation industry, a man with no feel for motorcycles or the men who made them. When the triple finally reached the market in September of 1968, as the Triumph Trident and its BSA sibling, the Rocket 3, it arrived crippled by its own makers. The price was set too high, well above what the American distributors thought they could sell against. The engineering, beneath the third cylinder, was honest pushrod Triumph practice. Sound, but unmistakably conventional. The old architecture with one more pot. And then there was the styling. The group had handed the appearance to an outside design house. And the result, the slab-sided bread bin tank and the strange-finned ray-gun silencers, divided opinion violently and delayed the launch by the better part of a year and a half. American dealers took one look and recoiled. The triple was a fine motorcycle, wearing a costume nobody had asked for, sold at a price nobody wanted to pay, 18 months later than it should have come. and it had beaten Honda's new machine to the market by a matter of weeks. Weeks. The British triple reached American showrooms just ahead of the Honda. For a few short weeks, the way out was actually on sale. Then the Honda landed, and the window closed, and it never opened again. But hold for a moment on the second tragedy, the one that ran in parallel, because while the triple was being mishandled, an even greater chance was being thrown away inside the company's own new research centre. Lionel Joffe's grand project was a gleaming new research and development establishment at a country house called Umberslade Hall, opened toward the end of 1968, staffed with some 300 people and running through perhaps £1.5 million a year. It should have been the future. Instead, the men on the factory floor christened it Slumberglade Hall because so much of its large staff had, in the bitter judgment of the engineers, no real experience of motorcycles at all. It was aviation thinking applied to a trade it did not understand. And it was at Umberslade, in 1967, that Hopwood and Healy laid before the company the boldest idea of all. Not a single new model, but a whole modular family of modern engines, sharing parts, scaling from a small single-up, through a triple and a four, to a great multi-cylinder flagship. A range, a future. The four-cylinder machine in that family could have met Honda head-on and beaten it to market, had the company committed to it then. The company said no. Eric Turner and Joffe passed it over, in favour of all things, of a pet project of the now-departing Edward Turner, a double overhead cam 350 twin, the machine known inside the works as the ET350. Hopwood was appalled. He wrote to Joffe in October of 1968, refusing to have anything to do with developing it, on the grounds that there was so much fundamentally wrong with it. Edward Turner, for his part, had warned Joffe about Hopwood in turn, that Hopwood would delay the thing for a year or two if he knew his man. The two finest reputations in the company locked against each other, while the modular range that might have saved everything gathered dust. The small twins that did emerge from this fight, the BSA Fury and its Triumph twin the Bandit, were cancelled on the very eve of production in 1971, having cost a fortune and earned nothing. So that was the position as the decade turned. The triple, sound but ill-dressed and overpriced, beaten to the punch by weeks. The modular four, which might have won the war, killed in committee. A research centre the workforce did not respect, burning through money, and two of the best engineers in Britain at each other's throats over the corpse of a small twin that should never have been favoured. The way out had been found, and drawn and prototyped, and then argued and dithered and priced and styled into oblivion. And now, into all of this, came the bike. Chapter 10. The bike. It was unveiled at the Tokyo Motor Show in the closing months of 1968, and shown to the British public the following April at the Brighton Show, in a hotel on the seafront, and from the moment the cover came off, the men who understood motorcycles understood that the ground had moved. The Honda CB 750. Look at what it was. 4 cylinders, set across the frame, where the British built 2, an overhead camshaft, where the British still used pushrods, an electric starter, press a button, and it ran, where the British rider swung a kickstart lever and hoped, a hydraulic disc brake on the front wheel, the first ever fitted to a mass-produced motorcycle, where the British used drums, 5 gears, 67 brake horsepower, a genuine 125 miles an hour, and it did not leak oil, not a drop, because the crankcase was split the modern way and sealed for good. The press christened it the first superbike, and the word was not marketing. There had genuinely never been anything quite like it offered to ordinary riders before. And then there was the price. In the United States, the market on which Triumph's whole existence depended, the Honda CB 750 carried a sticker of $1,495. The British triple, against which it now competed head-to-head, cost the thick end of $2,000. $400 more, for less of a motorcycle in nearly every measurable way. More cylinders for less money. A disc brake the British did not offer. An electric start they could not match. And no oil on the floor. Honda had been so unsure the thing would sell that it first planned to build only 1,500 a year and tooled the early engines accordingly, casting the crankcases in sand. Then the orders came and Honda revised the figure to 1,500 a month, then 3,000 a month, and in the end built very nearly 500,000 of that first generation before it moved on to something newer. The sand-cast engines that survive are collectors' treasures now, relics of the few weeks when even Honda did not yet grasp what it had made. What it had made was the end of British motorcycling, though it would take a little over a decade to finish the job. Out in California, the men who actually had to sell against it knew at once. Pete Coleman, who ran the BSA operation on the American West Coast, wrote to Lionel Joffe in February of 1969, within weeks of the Honda appearing, reporting that dealers were cancelling their orders for the Rocket 3, frightened they could not shift a more expensive, more conventional machine against this thing from Japan. The warning came up the chain, from the men with their hands on the actual sales to the man in the chair at Birmingham. It was the 1960 report all over again, in real time. And once again, it changed nothing. The British Triple, for all that, was no bad motorcycle. Given a chance to prove its engineering on the track, it proved it magnificently. The Triples took the first 3 places at the Daytona 200 in 1971, and a famous racing trident called Slippery Sam won the Isle of Man production race 5 years running. The machine was good. The trouble was never that the British could not build a fast motorcycle. The trouble was that they had built the right machine in the wrong suit, at the wrong price 3 years too late, while spurning the better machine entirely. And the Honda was cheaper, easier, cleaner, and from a company that could make 500,000 of them without breaking stride. And then, with the cliff edge already crumbling beneath their feet, the men running British motorcycling made the single worst decision of all. Chapter 11. The year everything broke. For the 1971 season, the BSA Group bet the company on a relaunch. They would bring out a whole new range, 13 models in all, across both the BSA and Triumph badges, built around a bold new idea, an oil-bearing frame. Instead of carrying the engine oil in a separate tank, the oil would live inside the large central tube of the frame itself. It was clever in principle. New frame, new forks, new conical wheel hubs, a fresh modern look for the whole range. They announced it at a lavish dinner at a grand London hotel. The great names of British motorcycling gathered to toast the future. The execution was a catastrophe almost beyond belief. The new frame raised the seat of the Bonneville, the most famous British motorcycle in the world, a machine whose every dimension American riders knew by heart, to a height of around 34 inches, too tall for a great many riders to sit on, with both feet flat on the ground. The single most important model in the range, redesigned so that the customer could not comfortably reach the floor. And the bikes were late, desperately, fatally late, and chaotic when they finally came. The tooling was not ready. The parts did not fit. The famous Triumph quality, already slipping, fell apart on the line. Around 3/4 of Triumph's production was meant to go to America, and the whole American business turned on hitting the spring selling season, when the dealers stocked up for the summer riders. The 1971 range missed it. The bikes that should have been in Californian showrooms in the spring were not built or not shipped or arrived broken. Thousands of machines ended up stranded, unsold in American warehouses, to be dumped later at heavy discount for losses that ran into millions. To complete the humiliation, one of the new frames is said to have broken clean through during testing at the proving ground. The damage was not recoverable. The BSA Group posted a trading loss of £8.5 million for the year, an enormous sum, 3 million of it from the motorcycle business alone. The company that had once built 1 in 4 of the world's motorcycles had, in a single season, designed a flagship its customers could not sit on, missed the only market that mattered, and lost a fortune doing it. Eric Turner went, Lionel Joffe went. The aristocratic lawyer Lord Shawcross was brought in at the head of a rescue committee to see what could be salvaged, but the truth was already plain to anyone willing to look. The independent BSA Group was finished. It had walked, with its eyes open and its own engineers shouting warnings, straight off the cliff that Edward Turner had photographed for them 11 years before. All that remained was to decide who would clear away the wreckage, and what, if anything, could be carried out of it alive. The answer came from the government, and it had a name. Dennis Poor. Chapter 12. The Closing of the Gates. By 1973, the BSA Group's shares had collapsed, and the company could not stand alone. So the government of the day stepped in and brokered a marriage, putting up nearly £5 million of public money to fold the ruined BSA Triumph business together with Norton, the last other significant British motorcycle maker, owned by a company called Manganese Bronze. The new combine was named Norton Villiers Triumph, and at its head stood the chairman of Manganese Bronze, Dennis Poor. Poor was a striking figure to find at the deathbed of an industry. A former racing driver, a wealthy and cultured man, given to quoting Kipling, an English patriot of the old school who worked 18-hour days and meant genuinely to save what he could. He inherited 4 factories: Small Heath, the old BSA works in Birmingham, the Norton plants at Andover and Wolverhampton, and Meriden, the home of Triumph. And Poor looked at his 4 factories and made a decision. He would concentrate production at Small Heath and Wolverhampton, and he would close Meriden. On paper, there was a logic to it, but the logic was bitterly contested, and it has been argued over ever since. Meriden was the most modern of the plants and the home of the most famous and most wanted product in the entire range, the Bonneville and the Tiger, the machines the American dealers were actually crying out for. A study by outside consultants had, before the merger, recommended closing the Victorian inner-city works at Small Heath and concentrating everything at Meriden, the exact opposite of what Poor now proposed. Meriden's workers had a name for militancy and, by the company's account, the worst productivity of the plants. That was Poor's case. The workers had a darker reading of it, that the valuable Meriden site, with its acres of land, was worth more cleared and sold than as a motorcycle factory. Whatever the true balance of reasons, the verdict was the same. The home of the Triumph would close. On the 14th of September, 1973, Dennis Poor came to Meriden for the first time, told the assembled management that the plant would shut with the loss of all 1,750 jobs, declined to take questions on the grounds that he had an urgent meeting back in London, and left. The men on the factory floor, the ones not in the meeting, did not hear it from Poor. They read it on the billboard of the midday Coventry Telegraph, propped up at the factory gates: Triumph Meriden to close. So they shut the gates themselves. They chained them. What began that afternoon would last 18 months. At first, it was a work-in. The men kept building bikes in defiance. And then, at a mass meeting at the start of October, they voted to blockade the works altogether, to let nothing in and nothing out. Around 80 men at a time picketed the gates in shifts, around the clock, through the autumn and into the winter. And what a winter! The winter of the 3-day week, when the whole country's power was rationed and the lights went out. They stood at those gates and would not let the machines, or the finished bikes, or the tooling leave. And because Meriden made parts the other factories needed, the blockade reached out and throttled production at Small Heath too. The men of Meriden had found the one lever they had left, and they pulled it, and they held on. They were not striking for higher wages. They were fighting for the right to keep doing the work their fathers had done, in the factory where they had spent their lives, building a motorcycle the world still wanted. The American dealers were still asking for Meriden Bonnevilles. The demand was real. It was only the boardroom that had decided the place must die. Through the long, cold months, they kept the watch. And into that standoff, in the summer of 1974, walked a politician who saw in it something more than an industrial dispute. Chapter 13. The Cooperative. His name was Tony Benn, and as Secretary of State for Industry in the new Labour government, he looked at the chained gates of Meriden and saw a flagship, a chance to prove that workers could own and run their own factory, a social experiment in industrial organisation. The previous government's subsidy had been pulled. Benn's own civil servants advised him, in plain terms, that a workers' cooperative at Meriden was not commercially viable, and that he should not back it. He backed it anyway. In the deal announced in July of 1974, the government put up 4.95 million pounds, a grant of £750,000, and a loan of just over 4 million more, to set the men of Meriden up as owners of their own works. They formed Meriden Motorcycles Limited. They adopted, in a gesture of real conviction, a single flat wage for every man from the floor to the top, no one to be paid more than another. And in March of 1975, 18 months after Dennis Poor had walked out of the gate, the line at Meriden started up again, under the ownership of the men who worked it. The leaders of it were not famous men, and they should be named, because they earned it. Dennis Johnson, the first chairman of the Cooperative Committee. John Rosamond, a frame welder who became the spokesman for the welders, and then, from 1977, the second and last chairman of the whole enterprise. who would one day write the book that told its story. Bill Lapworth of the Transport and General Workers Union, men from the union conveners' ranks who had stood at the gates all winter and now found themselves, improbably, the directors of a motorcycle company. Ben came down to Meriden and was cheered through the crowd. For a moment it looked as though something had been pulled back from the edge, but the rest of Norton Villiers' triumph was dying around them. NVT lost over £3 million by the end of 1974. The Norton factory at Andover went down after a sit-in of its own. Wolverhampton was reduced to a sit-in too. Poor's company fought on with the Norton Commando, a fine, fast twin now fitted, belatedly, with an electric starter, and the last of the Triumph triples, the Trident T160. But it was not enough, against Japan, against the losses, against the times. In the middle of 1975, the government decided it had seen enough, noting that some £25 million of public money had already gone into the industry. The last new Norton Commandos came off the line at Wolverhampton in 1977. The following year, 1978, Norton Villiers' Triumph was wound up and gone. And still, against all of it, the Meriden Cooperative survived. It outlived the company that had tried to close it. The men kept building the Bonneville, year after year, into the 1980s, even developed new versions of it, an 8-valve engine, fresh ideas on an old and beloved machine. They had been told they could not run a factory, and for the better part of a decade, they did. What killed them in the end was not Japan, and not the boardroom, and not their own management. It was the pound. In the early 1980s, the country pursued a policy of high interest rates, and the pound soared on the strength of North Sea oil, up to nearly $2.50. And the Meriden Bonneville, like the Triumphs before it, lived and died on the American market, where 3/4 of its sales had always gone. At $2.45 to the pound, a British motorcycle in an American showroom was simply too dear to sell. The thing the cooperative made was as good as it had ever been. The exchange rate priced it out of existence. There was one last chance. A plan to sell the great underused Meriden site, now rezoned for housing and worth far more as land than as a factory, and move the cooperative to a smaller leased works at Cash's Lane in Coventry. It very nearly came off. It collapsed at the final hurdle when the promised lease fell through. The government had already written off some £9 million of the cooperative's debt. There was nothing more to be done. In August of 1983, the Meriden Motorcycle Cooperative closed. Where 1,750 men had been made redundant 10 years before, a remnant of a few hundred remained at the end to turn off the lights. A small firm in Devon kept building the Bonneville under licence, in tiny numbers, until 1988. And then even that stopped, and the Triumph Bonneville, the machine Edward Turner's twin had become, the bike that Brando and McQueen had made into a symbol of everything free and fast and young, was no longer made anywhere on earth. Chapter 14. Bonneville Close. The factory at Meriden was pulled down in 1984. Go there now. There is no works. There is no hooter, no chained gate, no smell of cutting oil on the morning air, no line of men coming down the Coventry Road in the grey light. There is a housing estate. Neat, quiet, ordinary. The kind of place built all over England in the years since. Children grow up there who have never heard a test engine run, and the streets of that estate have names. One of them is called Bonneville Close. Another is called Daytona Drive. That is what remains of the home of the Triumph. The names of the machines, painted on street signs, over the ground where the machines were made. At Small Heath, where 14 gunsmiths had begun it all in 1861, where the largest motorcycle factory in the world had once stood, most of the great works was demolished too. A business park covers much of the ground now. A few early blocks are said to still stand among it. Among the oldest reinforced concrete industrial buildings in the country, unlisted, their future uncertain, mostly unremarked by the people who passed them. The gun trade that gave the company its name left its mark on the wider district in other ways. The old Birmingham gun quarter would lend its shadows much later to a famous television drama. But of the motorcycle works, the thing that made BSA a name on 4 continents, there is almost nothing left to see. There is a coda, and it is real, and it is bittersweet rather than sweet. In 1983, as the receiver cleared away the wreckage, the Triumph name and its rights were bought by a Midlands property developer named John Bloor. Contrary to the legend, Bloor did not buy Meriden for its houses. That land went to someone else. Bloor wanted to build motorcycles. He asked John Rosamond, the last chairman of the cooperative, to bring a handful of the old Meriden men into an entirely new company. And at a new factory at Hinckley in Leicestershire, that company designed an all-new range from a clean sheet and relaunched the Triumph name at the Cologne show in 1990. Triumph today is a genuine British success, selling fine motorcycles around the world. But it is a new company that bought an old name. It is not the line that ran unbroken from the Speed Twin through Meriden. That line was cut. The men who laced the wheels by ear, the liner who drew the gold stripe freehand with his sword, the testers who rode the prototypes to destruction down the Warwickshire lanes. Their factory was demolished, and their craft scattered, and their bargain with the works broken for good. What rose at Hinckley is a worthy heir. It is not a resurrection. Chapter 15. What remains? They were warned. That is the thing that stays with you in the end. They were warned in writing, in 1960, by the most respected man among them, who crossed the world and saw exactly how the thing would be done to them, and came home and wrote it down and called it frightening, and then could not make himself believe the last fatal inch of it. They were warned again by their own engineers, who drew the machine that might have saved them and were argued into silence. They were warned a third time, in real time, by the men in California with the order books in their hands, who watched the dealers cancel and sent the word up the line. And none of it was enough. Not because the men who ran British motorcycling were stupid or wicked or did not care, but because it is a very hard thing to believe, when you are standing in the full sun at the top of the world, that the ground is already going beneath you, and harder still to spend the fortune and break the habits and admit the error that believing it would require. The British motorcycle did not fall to one Japanese motorcycle, however brilliant. It fell to 20 years of reasonable-seeming decisions, each one easier than the alternative, made by men who could not quite imagine that the warmth they were standing in would ever fade. The Honda was only the messenger. It said, in chrome and 4 cylinders and a price $400 lower, the same thing Edward Turner had written 11 years before. The future is already here. It is only waiting for you to look. And so, the largest, proudest, most glamorous motorcycle industry the world had ever seen, the one Brando rode and McQueen loved, and the whole earth wanted, became, in a little over a decade, a demolished factory under a quiet housing estate in the village that once called itself the centre of England. Stand on Bonneville Close on an ordinary afternoon. It is very quiet. The children play. The cars sit in the drives, and under the tarmac and the gardens lies the floor, where the most famous motorcycle in the world was built by hand, by men who believed, with good reason, and to the very last, that they were the best there had ever been. They were. For a while, they truly were.